if if you are the best of the best, first class, cream of the crop, valedictorian, voted most likely to succeed, you're on the list of most successful people, whatever that is, you're kind of one of the elite. Listen, if that's you, I've got good news for you. God can still use you. But God specializes in using the ordinary average person. And thank goodness for that. But today I want us to jump in, and I want to specifically speak to those of you that maybe are here today and you struggle to believe that God would have something significant ahead for you. Not just for you, but for maybe the people around you. That God would choose to use you for a specific purpose, to do something extraordinary, to set you up for supernatural work in the natural world that you spend your time in. I wanted to encourage you today that there is an assignment on your life. And we're kicking off a new teaching series today that we're going to be in for the next several weeks. We're going to be in the Book of Nehemiah, titled Made for More. Because every single one of us, when we step into a relationship with Jesus, when we receive his free gift, when we step into that, then we step into not just the gift of new life and gift of a relationship with our Heavenly Father, but we step into a new purpose. And for every follower of Jesus, there is a special plan, a special purpose, a unique purpose for your life. And you've been wired that way. You've been designed specifically that way. And I think that over the next few weeks, specifically today even, that this could potentially change the course for your life. That you could get down the road and begin to look back and see not only has God done a work in you, but he's done a work through you in the lives of those that you have influence with. And you'll be able to even look back and see that there are people that you've come in contact with, that you've interacted with, that God has given you favor with, that now would look and say, you know what, if because of him, my life is different. Because of her, I know who Jesus is, because she introduced me to Jesus, because she cared about me when I was hurting. I think that that could be true for every single one of us in the room. But I want to warn you that it comes at a cost. It comes with a price, a significant cost. It comes with pain and heartache and hurt, discomfort. It comes with inconvenience. But when you get down the road and you begin to see where God has used you to do the work that he wants to do, you don't care about the price that you paid to be a part of the difference that God made. And I think that's true for every single one of us. And I think this will begin to kind of become more clear in our minds as we study an Old Testament book. If you have your Bible, you can go ahead and turn there. We're going to start in chapter 1. Nehemiah chapter 1. If you aren't sure where it is, use the table of contents. If you're like, man, if I use the table of contents, people are going to look at me funny, and they're going to know that I don't know my Bible as well as maybe I should. Don't worry about it. Nobody's judging you. They're cheating anyways because they're probably on their Bible app, and they don't have to turn to the table of contents because they just scroll real fast and they see it, and then they're there. But you go all the way through, kind of starting in the Old Testament. Before, if you get to Psalms, you've gone too far. If you're still in like 2 Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel, you haven't gone far enough. So we're going to start in the book of Nehemiah, starting in chapter 1. And it's a story of a man that quickly we realize is heartbroken because of what has happened to his people. He's devastated by what he's hearing about his people. But it's something that I think we can find ourselves in this story. A story that comes from 2,500 years ago in a different culture, a different setting, different cultural norms, but that we can see God working and we can see where God wants to work in us and through us. And so there's a lot to discover and a lot to unpack here. But you see an ordinary man be used for an incredible impact. He's not a pastor. He's not a priest. He's not a prophet. He's just an ordinary guy. In fact, we find out that if you skip to the last verse, we're going to start in the last verse of chapter 1. The last part of the last verse in chapter 1, it says, "Now I, being Nehemiah, was the cupbearer to the king." So Nehemiah, this ordinary guy, was actually not part of this culture of people. He's actually a slave who became a cupbearer for the king Artaxerxes. This is significant. He's living as a servant, as a slave, but he's living in one of the best settings that a slave or a servant maybe could ever find themselves. But specifically in this setting, the King Artaxerxes, would be somebody who enjoyed to drink wine. And so Nehemiah's job is to taste the wine before the king does, to make sure that there's nothing in there that would be toxic for the king, that might take the life of the king. So imagine for a second the access that Nehemiah would have, the conversations that he would overhear about potential battle plans or about how someone in the palace is not operating at the standard they need to operate. And he would have access to all kinds of information and high-ranking officials. So he would have to be somebody with some integrity, with some loyalty. It's a fascinating role for an ordinary person. There's probably some pros to the job. One would be it's a government job. He's got a government job, so he's pretty set. But he also probably gets to taste some really good wine, because I would assume that the king's not drinking just the cheap stuff. He's drinking the fine wine. I don't drink wine. I don't really care for wine. Maybe it's because I don't ever want to spend money on wine, but maybe the good stuff is more expensive. I would assume the king would drink the good stuff. The cons would be, though, is that every single day that you go to work to taste the wine could be your last day. If this was my job, I would want to make sure that I had good benefits, not just for me while I was alive, but for my family. You know, I'd want to make sure there's a good life insurance policy attached to my role, my responsibility, because you never know what the day is going to turn out like. It could all change in a moment, depending on how that press conference goes. It could go south really fast. I mean, just imagine today if they had cupbearers still. I assume there's better systems in place to protect those that are in power, but imagine that. This is Nehemiah's job. It's not an ideal job, but it's not a terrible job either. And I think it'd be really easy to think, if you were in Nehemiah's situation at a certain point, to think, man, why has God allowed me to become a servant of another people? And I think we can find ourselves in the same kind of understanding sometimes, thinking, God, why have you put me in this place? Why? It feels like, God, you've pushed me down, or you've pushed me back, or you've dismissed me, or there's not something for me. It seems like there's something for everyone else, but I just don't know that there's something for me. And I think it'd be really easy for Nehemiah to think this way. I feel like God maybe pushed him out. But I think one of the things I find encouraging as we jump into this is that God didn't push Nehemiah out, but instead he set Nehemiah up into a position to be a part of something incredible, something extraordinary. It's almost as if this happens, and it happens to Nehemiah in a way that you wouldn't think would happen, and then God says, now watch me use this guy, the guy that nobody would expect me to use. So it's just a regular day for a cupbearer in the palace, an ordinary guy hears something that changes the entire course of his life. So we're going to go back to verse 1, chapter 1. It says this. It says, now the words of Nehemiah, the son of, I'm not going to say this in the real Hebrew because there might be something that would be bad, but you pronounce this in a really difficult way. But the Hakaliah, now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them about the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. So Nehemiah is writing this, and he's reflecting back to a conversation that he has with his brother. And so he's having this conversation. He's asking his brother, how are our people? What is going on back in our homeland? What is going on with our family back home? Now, what's important to know is that 140 years prior to this, the people of Israel had been taken over by the Babylonians. King Nebuchadnezzar had taken them out. They had completely destroyed the Temple of Solomon. They had destroyed everything that they owned. And so the people of Israel had found themselves in a place of destruction. This was a tragic scene for the Israelites 140 years prior. And they're still somewhat stuck in this hopeless place. That's where this story starts to pick up. And it's important for us to know that this wasn't God's way of punishing them, but what you see as you go back and you read the story and the accounts of what happened to the Israelites is they chose to turn their back on God. So God didn't punish them for that, but instead he allowed them to receive what it was they were trying to pursue. They had turned their back on God. And when we turn our back on God, we're not just turning our back on God's protection. We're turning our back on his provision. We're turning our back on everything that he could be for us because we think that our way might be better. And this is what has happened to the Israelites, and they had found themselves in this situation. Decades later, there's a remnant of the Israelites who have gone back to Jerusalem to rebuild. And this is what Nehemiah begins to hear about. He begins to hear about the struggle, about the difficulty. In verse 3, it says, "And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and disgrace, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." The wall is significant here. Imagine that, a government concerned about a wall. No protection for the city. It's vulnerable. This was a big deal in this day because of the way that the cities were constructed and built is because was done so to protect people from intruders, to protect people from the outsiders. It's what allowed them to be safe and to feel like they could thrive. And their wall has been torn down, so the city has been destroyed. There's no leadership, there's no direction, there's no vision for the people. This is the hopeless situation that Nehemiah is finding out about from his brother. Let me ask you this before we jump in, because I think this is what we see begin to play out. But what do you do when you're burdened by something that God has put on your mind or that God has put on your heart? What do you do when you feel that? That's some of what Nehemiah is feeling as well. He's feeling this weight, this burden. Look what it says in verse 4. "Now, when I had heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days." It says, "When I sat down, I wept and mourned for days." In this moment, you begin to see that Nehemiah, and we'll see this as we continue on, he realizes that this is not okay. And that he's going to have to do something about it. That he needs to move. He needs to respond. He needs to act. He needs to do something. So how do we recognize what it looks like to be made for more and see what it looks like for us in our own assignment to see what it looks like to live in this supernatural life in this natural world? Well, there's three things that we see happening for Nehemiah. The first thing he does is he sees the situation and he simply just sits in the burden or sits in the grief. He feels the ache. He feels the pain. He experiences the heartache as he hears this news of what's happening to his people in Jerusalem. What's fascinating is this isn't just a few blocks away. This is up to 1,000 miles away. This is a long way away for Nehemiah. It'd be really easy for Nehemiah just to think, well, you know what? Out of sight, out of mind. That stinks for them. But I'm okay. I'm sad for them, but I'm grateful I'm not there with them. It'd be really easy for him to be in that place. That's someone else's problem. I'm gonna stay here in the king's palace, keep eating the king's food, tasting the king's wine, watching TV on the king's 4K big screen TV, taking selfies, saying humbled to serve. Like this is how I'm gonna roll, and just completely dismiss what's happening to his people thousands of miles away. But we see that that's not what he does. He finds himself in a comfortable place with all of his needs being met, and he hears the devastating news, the injustice that has happened to his people. And what does he do? He sits in that. It says that he is wept and he mourned for days. There's something important for us to see. Oftentimes, God gets our attention and he begins to lead us to respond to something, to do something that he's called us for, that he's assigned us to, that he's created us with a unique design to do. And oftentimes it happens when we're most comfortable, which means he's calling us to turn our back on the comfortable and embrace the uncomfortable, the messy, the difficult, the inconvenient. You know, I think sometimes in our comfortable Christianity, we can begin to think, well, I know God would like for me to do that, or I know that God would like me to spend more time doing this, or that I should have this conversation with this person, but I just don't have time for that. My life is too busy. I've got too much going on. It's inconvenient. I'll just say this. The text doesn't say this, but I think we can get a glimpse of this. If there's never times in your walk with Jesus that you're led to inconvenient things, you might not be walking with Jesus. Because he often leads us to inconvenient places, uncomfortable places. Because it takes us to a place where we realize that we don't have the strength to do what is necessary in those moments. And we've got to rely on a strength that's greater than ours. This supernatural strength that only comes from God. See this with some of the people on the story team sometimes. I hear stories about, just this week even, someone on a story team is sick and struggling with something, and it's interesting when there's medical issues or there's something difficult or tragic that happens in someone's life. It's never in a convenient moment. It never happens in the 9 to 5 window when maybe you could leave work because you need a reason to get away from work. It always happens at night, right before you're about to go to bed, when you've already got the kids to bed, you've already had dinner, and you're kind of sitting down, you're just having some relaxing time, and then you get the phone call. And I hear story after story how story team members on various teams are caring for one another, even when it's inconvenient. They're being the hands and feet of Jesus to those that they serve with, to those that they walk alongside, and the different responsibilities and roles they carry in their story teams. I think that's what it looks like to follow Jesus to the places that he calls us to be a part of the work that he's calling us to be a part of. In this moment, Nehemiah has a choice to make. He could have pushed it away. He could have dismissed it. He could have said, you know what? I hate that for him. But instead, he sits in it, and he allows it to move from his head to his heart. And in this, I think God begins to stir something up in him, because we see it change in this verse. I didn't read the whole verse, but before we go on to the rest of it, let me ask you this. What is it that really breaks your heart when you look at the world around you? The people that you spend time with, the things you maybe see on TV or social media. Because sometimes it might be something that's far-reaching, and sometimes it's something that's just right next door or in the very next cubicle. What is it that breaks your heart, that really grieves you? You know, I talk to different people, and you can have conversations with people. You can see people that are doing things because their heart was broken for someone. I think about Elisa with Entrusted Houston, one of our local partners that we serve alongside and that we help support. And she had a burden to serve adoption and foster families in Harris County. And so she created this organization called Entrusted Houston, and she serves and cares for thousands of children in Harris County because she felt a burden. She felt that. She ached for that. And she felt like God was leading her to do something for it. You can say the same thing is true for Robbie and her team with Two Lives Changed. Some of you serve alongside these organizations. David Mullen, who goes to church here, he has a burden for people that have experienced trauma, specifically in military. And so he spent his time this last weekend for 3 or 4 days serving people who are dealing with significant trauma because of some of their military experiences, because he has a burden for that. There's an ache in his heart for that. And oftentimes it's the things that break our heart that God is wanting to pull us towards, because he wants to use us to do the work that he is going to do in the lives of those people. And oftentimes we sit, we see it, and we feel sad about it, but we don't really sit and feel the burden of that. That's what Nehemiah is doing. He is sitting in this, and he's feeling the burden for his people. Several years ago, I was on staff at a church in the Dallas area, and a great church, definitely a more traditional church. And before I go any further, I'm not cracking on traditional church. There's a lot of things about traditional church that have formed a lot of foundational things when it comes to my faith. I think there's a lot of things we've moved past that come from traditional church settings that are incredibly valuable. And so I think there's a healthy blend and a healthy mix, but we can't get stuck on some of the traditions. And so I just want to say that just to bring some clarification that I'm not dismissing the traditional church. But there were 2 incredible conversations I had in 1 week's time. When I was on staff, I was the youth pastor, and I had this opportunity to start connecting with and serving one of the local football teams there in that area. And I got to know the head football coach, who was a believer in Jesus and passionate about seeing God use him in the locker room with his teams and with his players. And God began to do an incredible work. And I got to come alongside and just be a part of it. And we started hosting team dinners for their football team. And we're hosting, tons of students, athletes from JV and varsity football teams who don't know Jesus and have never stepped foot in a church. And all of a sudden they're stepping foot on our campus, and they're having dinner, and they're eating meals. And I would make a highlight video for them. We would feed them food, and then I would share the gospel every single week. I would just tell them about the good news of Jesus and connect it to sports and athletics and football. And over the next several weeks, several of these students placed their faith in Jesus. More than 20 of them started following Jesus because of this opportunity. It was this incredible thing. And then we started baptizing them and celebrating that they had made these decisions. It was amazing. It was an incredible thing. And none of them had ever stepped foot in any of our normal church programming or services or anything that we had offered, but yet we had this opportunity to connect. And there was one student, one player who gave his life to Jesus, and he wanted to get baptized with his friends, with his teammates. And so he talked to his parents, and his parents said, absolutely not. And so he talked to me about that. He said, my dad won't let me get baptized. And I was like, oh man, I'm really sorry to hear that. And he said, yeah, he was super disappointed. I said, do you think your dad would be okay if I just stopped by and talked to him? Which I didn't want to do. And he said, I don't know, man. He said, I don't think it's going to work. And I said, well, it's worth a shot. I said, I'll stop by. And so he's like, okay. So he set it up and I stopped by the house. I was so nervous. I was like, man, this, I don't have any idea what I'm about to step into. But I knew how bad this guy wanted to get baptized with his teammates. And so I stopped by and we just started having a conversation and just got to know each other a little bit. And started talking to the dad. And I said, well, you'd probably know the real reason that I'm here is I want to talk to you about baptism. And immediately he started telling me all the things he disliked about the church. And he hated the way that you had to dress up and look nice and kind of put on this fake smile to show up with people who were also fake. And he just started calling out all the stereotypical things about church people. I was like, man, I'm really sorry you feel that way. And I understand why you feel that way. And then he told me something that helped me understand why he felt that way. He said when he was a kid, when he was in elementary school, him and his brother, their parents didn't go to church, but there was a church bus that would come by their neighborhood and would pick up all the kids and take them to church every Sunday. And he said they picked him and his brother up a couple of times, and then they quit picking him and his brother up. They would actually pull onto the street, pick up all the kids, and drive right past him and his brother. Because they were rough kids. They were out of control sometimes. And he knew that. He said, I know that we were a pain. He said, I'll never forget sitting there, standing up, and the bus driving right by us. And he said, I thought the first time maybe it was just a mistake. So we were ready the next week. They drove up, picked up the other kids, and went right by us. And he said, I'll never go to that place. He said, if they won't pick up some kids, then there's something wrong there. I can't get behind this. And man, I was devastated for him. It just bothered me. It shook me up. And it wasn't the church that I was on staff at that happened with. I don't even know where the church was. That conversation happened. And then just a few days later, I had another conversation with a gentleman in our church who was an older gentleman. And he'd been in the church for a long time. And he walked up to me one Sunday after we had a business meeting. And he said to me, Wes, do we not pay you enough to not wear jeans on Sundays? And I was like, yeah, you do. And then in my head, I didn't say this, but I'm thinking to myself, the jeans I had on that day were more expensive than any suit I owned. Because I didn't spend money on suits. I was looking for like the $80 Walmart suit, if it was even $80. I wasn't spending a lot of money on a suit. But we started having this conversation. I said, man, honestly, sir, I don't really spend a lot of time with people that wear suits. And he goes, I know. And I said, and I'm a student pastor. Like, students aren't walking around school wearing suits. And he said, I get it. But you need to set the example. You need to set the tone. They need to look to you and think, that's what I need to look like. And I was like, I don't know that that's true. I said, honestly, I think if I showed up at schools, and it was a respectful conversation. I was really glad we had it. Because I think he actually heard some of the things I said and vice versa. And I said, well, I just think it actually puts up more walls with the students that I'm connected with. And I'm not going to have a voice in their life. And he said, well, you might not, but if you can get them here, then when their parents show up, their parents will see that you're a respectable young man because you're dressed nice, and they're going to want to come to church here. And I was like, man, I just don't see it. I don't see it. And this was coming on the heels of the conversation I had just a few days earlier about the other one who wasn't able to come to church because they wouldn't pick him up because he didn't look right, because he didn't act right. And I was just like, man, what is going on? And I began to process through all that. And both of those conversations, I think God used to break my heart, but also to show me what it looks like to really care about people and to really be the church. Because it's not about what people look like. It's not about what they act like. It's about who they are and where they're at with their Heavenly Father who loves them. And how can I help connect them to Him and let God do what He wants to do in their life? So it's not about what they wear. It's not about the words they say or how they talk or their background. It's really all about the God that loves them. And I just want to do whatever it takes to help introduce them to Him. And so I don't care about what they look like. I don't care what they're dressed like. But those two conversations were huge in my life and huge in helping lead and guide and direct me in how to do ministry and how to care for people in the church and what church looks like. I think a similar moment is happening for Nehemiah in this passage. Nehemiah gets to a place where he's devastated. He's hurting. I think God begins to use that to lead him to something else. Look what it says, second half of verse 4. It says, now when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. If it's big enough to cry about, it's big enough to pray about. And not as like a last resort, like, well, I don't know what else to do, so I guess we'll pray about it. Like, what an insult to God that would be. But he feels the weight of this. He stopped long enough to just begin to process it and think about it. And he begins to pray about it. He continues on, he says, I said, please, Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps the covenant and faithfulness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Notice, he's in a moment where he's grieving, he's weeping, he's mourning, yet he's calling out the goodness of God. He's calling out who God is, what he's done, what his promises are. He says, let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have committed against you. I and my father's house have sinned. Goes on in verse 7. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. It's almost as if Nehemiah understands, God, I understand how we got to where we've gotten. I understand why my people are in the situation that they're in, because they chose to turn their back on you. And he's confessing their sins. He's confessing the sins of people. He's agreeing with God's ways in this moment. He says, remember, please, the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I have chosen to have my name dwell. They are your servants and your people. Remember, this is Nehemiah speaking, whom you redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. Please, Lord, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name. And please make your servant successful today and grant him mercy before this man. He's speaking of the king because he's about to go to the king and ask the king if he can leave and go and help rebuild the wall for his people. You see, he felt the weight of the burden. He sat in the burden and he understood, God is leading me to do something. I can't sit and just dismiss this. I wonder how many times over the previous decades people walked by and thought, man, we should rebuild the wall. There had to be more people that had the thought, but nobody ever did anything. All of a sudden, Nehemiah hears about it. God puts it on his heart. He sits in the burden, and then he begins to seek God's goodness. We want to live on assignment to live a supernatural life in the natural world around us. Then we sit in the burden, then we begin to seek God's goodness. You see this with Nehemiah throughout the book. He's someone who prays continually. We read a lot of prayers. We read a lot of specific prayers that he's praying. Here he's confessing his sins. He's confessing the sins of his people. He's reminding God of God's promises. He's seeking out the goodness of God. And then he begins to ask for God's favor as he goes and asks permission from the king if he can go and rebuild. You know, it's interesting when you think about your prayer life, what you pray about most often reveals what you think about God. I mean, consider the times when you pray and what comes to mind when you're praying. What is it you're praying about? What are you praying for? You're like, well, I pray before every meal and I pray before I go to bed every night. that God will help me rest. And like sometimes our prayers are not at all what we see in Scripture. What would it look like for us to begin to pray bold prayers? God, move me. God, use me. God, empower me. God, I'm terrified and I don't even know what to do, but I know that something has to be done and I see it, I recognize it, which means you've probably called me to it. So God, even though I feel inadequate, just would you make me adequate? Would you do through me what I can't do through myself? You see this with Nehemiah, and all through the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a leadership guru. He's a leadership genius. I mean, he knows how to delegate. He knows how to empower. He knows how to cast vision. He knows how to strategize. He knows how to face opposition, how to minimize distractions. But before any of that, he precedes everything in his leadership with prayer. Prayer precedes everything in Nehemiah's life. So he's praying and he's asking God for his favor as he begins to do what God has called him to do. Look what it says as you jump into chapter 2. It says, and it came about in the month Nisan, which came after the month of Toyota, which was right before the month of Ford, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I picked up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence, so the king said to me, why is your face so sad, though you are not ill? I mean, Nehemiah clearly is someone who wasn't always just down. Nehemiah, I don't think you would describe as an Eeyore based on how the king's response to, he recognizes there's something wrong with Nehemiah. So the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, though you're not ill? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid, because this could cost Nehemiah his life. You weren't allowed to be down. You weren't allowed to be weak in the king's presence. He says, "Why should my face not be sad when the city, the site of my father's tombs, is desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What would you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. Then I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, I request that you send me to Judah, the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." So how do you live out a supernatural life in the natural world? You got to sit in the burden. You got to seek God's goodness. And then you got to start the work. This is deep. Start the work. Do something. Stand up and act. Turn your prayers into something productive. It was his prayers that were fueled by this burden that led him to respond the way that he responded, to actually do something about what was taking place. What would this look like for us? What would it look like for us to feel the burden for the things going on around us, the brokenness going around us, the injustice, the difficulties, the struggles, and to feel that burden and to begin to pray, not just that God would do a miracle in their life, but God, use me, whatever it is you want to do in my life and through my life to address some of the hurt and some of the heartache going on around me. Whatever that is, God, do that. And then actually stand up and respond and actually act with the capacity that we have to act. Sometimes people have asked me over the years, and I totally understand why people do this. So if you've done this, I'm not judging you, because we had this conversation I'm about to share with you. There's times where people walk up to me and say, "Hey, I have this coworker who I really want to tell about Jesus, and I really want to reach. And would you be willing to sit down and talk to them and meet with them and tell them about Jesus? God's really put it on my heart that we need to reach this person." And I've had that conversation before, and here's how I respond every single time. No. But you can. Because if God puts it on your heart, then he's equipped you to have the conversation. You have the relationship. You have the personal equity with that person. I'm just your pastor that they've never met. And honestly, when I sit down to talk to a person who I've never met and they find out that I'm a pastor, they don't know how to have a conversation anymore. Everything changes. They change the way they talk. They change the way that they think about story. It puts people into like a paralysis in conversation sometimes. It's funny, I don't like to tell people that I'm a pastor when I'm just out in some random scene, social setting, because they do that. What's funny, though, is if I don't tell them, and then we get 30 minutes in the conversation, and then all of a sudden somebody says, "So what do you do, Wes?" "Well, I'm a pastor." It's like the brakes get locked down, and they start thinking back to everything they said in the past 30 minutes, and they're thinking, "Man, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that in front of a pastor." It gets weird. It gets awkward. So my point in all that is if God has given you a burden for somebody that you're connected with that is far from God, then he's given you that burden for a reason, for a purpose, and he wants to use you in that, not your pastor. Now, I'll come alongside, and I'll support you, and I'll help you, but I'm telling you, not only does God want to do something great through you while you're serving someone around you, but he wants to do something in you as you serve. Oftentimes, he does some of his greatest work in the inconvenient, uncomfortable moments in our lives when he's called us to respond, to act, to do something. It's something significant that he does in us as we respond with obedience. And we see this happening in the life of Nehemiah as we continue in this book over the next several weeks. But I want us to consider and just to think, as we started Church Story, in the very beginning, we started praying. We just said, man, we want this to be a place where people come together and they find a group of people who genuinely care about them. Because that's how Jesus lived. Jesus genuinely cared. He cared about the people that he interacted with. We want people to feel like they're known. We want people to see people at church that actually know their names. Like Cheers got it right. They figured it out. A place where everybody knows your name. Thankfully, 15 people got what I just said. Where everybody knows their name. And the reason they know their name is because they genuinely care about them as people, as a person. And there's something valuable about that. Church is not a place where we just show up and we're a face in the crowd and then we leave. but it's a place where we connect, where we know and we care for one another. And while we're caring for one another, we're also caring for the community around us. We want to know the community. We want to know the names of people in our community, regardless if they ever darken the doors of our church gathering places. We want to know them in a way that they feel cared for. They feel supported. They feel like they have someone they can call on. We want to be a group of people who, if all of a sudden Church Story just disappeared tomorrow, the community around it would grieve because they know how much this group of people care about them. That was our prayer. That was our heartbeat behind what we started with Church Story. But there's a time where gathering together like this is fine, but there's not a lot of time where God calls us to sit on the sidelines. He calls us to show up and to engage and to become known, but then to jump in and be a part of it. And this is for every single one of us. He's called all of us to participate in the mission that he's called us to. And it starts when we see a burden, we see a need. We begin to pray about that and ask God to work in it because we don't have the capacity to do the work ourselves. And then we begin to respond. I came across this Franciscan blessing this week that was super convicting and compelling to consider. And I want to read it to you. It'll be on the screen behind me, but it says this: May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. It's a fascinating blessing. It's, I think, a compelling one to consider for ourselves, because he's called us to do something that we're not capable of doing, that we cannot do, but he wants to do as we respond, and he wants to do that through us. I don't know who this is for today. I mean, I know that it's for all of us, but I think there's some that are probably really in a place where you recognize a need, or you know somebody that you work with that is walking through something, and there's an opportunity there to truly care and to have compassion and to serve and to minister to them. And it's real easy to see those situations and think to ourselves, man, I see it, I hate it, but I just don't have the time. Or I don't have the bandwidth, or I don't have what it takes. I'm not the pastor, I'm not a priest, I'm not a prophet, I don't have the training, I don't have the skill set, I don't have all the experience. But I don't think God would open your eyes to a need around you and then not equip you and provide for you what you need to step into that, to step into it and be a difference maker in the life of someone else or in the life of several other people around you that you have influence with. You may not be able to do everything, but you can do something. So what is the something that you can do? To feel it, to ache for it, to begin to pray about it, and then have the faith to act. And you think, man, Wes, I just don't know. Like, people are going to mock me. It's going to be costly. I told you that from the very beginning. It's going to be costly. But don't let the enemy try to tell you that you're not capable. Because often, you don't have to be chosen by man if you're called by God. Don't let man determine what God has called you to do. Trust God's provision in your life, trust God's leading in your life, and then just simply respond to that. And then watch as God begins to work. I'll close with this thought. As I was processing through this last night, I wasn't planning on saying this, and my mind just started kind of going here. And I really thought after the elections in November that the political climate and arguments and whatever you want to call it would start to kind of calm down a little bit. What a fool I was. You're like, wow, Wes, you're not very smart. And that's a true statement. But there's a lot of anger and a lot of frustration and a lot of things going on in our world that people on both sides are just losing their minds about, shouting at each other, upset with each other. And there's even been some who have come to me and say, hey, why don't you talk about this more? Or why don't you talk about that more? Or why don't you address this going on in our society? And so I want to address something. No, I really don't. I could, and I will if God leads me to do that. I could start addressing specific things, and man, I could get people real fired up real fast on both sides. Some people be angry with me. Some people be like, yeah, let's go. But I don't think that's what God has called us to. But I think there's something going on here where we get just a little bit off track because we see things we don't agree with, or we see things happening that we don't think should be happening. And we're becoming focused on these things and becoming distracted by those things. And so we become a mouthpiece of opposition or an affirmation of whatever those things are. And we think, man, I'm making a difference. I'm bold. I'm courageous as a keyboard warrior, telling everybody what I think on social media. And I think we maybe even have good intentions, but maybe we're missing the mark. Because what we need is not more people yelling at the world to get right. What we need people who are focused on who God is and looking at ourselves in the mirror and realizing that we're not right with him. And as we begin to get right with him, we trust him and we let him lead us to make a difference in the way that he's called us to. Because what this world needs is not more people shouting from different political platforms. What we need is revival. We need an awakening. We need Jesus to open the eyes of his people to who he is and who he's called us to be and begin to respond to that. And revival is not going to come through the White House. Revival is going to come from the church house, from the people sitting in the church house, waking up to who God is and seeing who he is and seeing that there is a world of people around us who don't know him and are in desperate need of him. See, the story of Nehemiah is not a story just about a wall. It's so much bigger than a wall. It's a story about the redemption of God's people, the restoration of a relationship with God. And it took one man to respond, to begin to put that movement into motion. And so what would it look like for us to feel that weight, to feel that same burden, to recognize that there's restoration of people needed around us, the people that you know, the people that you interact with, the people that you sit with every single week, and to feel the weight of that and the heartache attached to it, and then begin to fall on our knees and beg God to do through us what only he can do. And then act and work and respond and begin to live in the supernatural that he's called us to live in this natural world and go and make a difference. What would that look like?